Isn't that awesome? Well, this is what's awesome, getting to share the Word of God with God's people. This lesson comes from the book of Hosea. I love the Old Testament prophets, and especially the minor prophets. I call it the heart of God. It could be called the tragedy of the parsonage, for other reasons other than what's written, but it's there. Hosea is an autobiographical book. It's a story of a prophet's broken home and a prophet's broken heart. It's the 8th century BC, a time of gross immorality among the people of God. Amos said in Amos chapter 2, verse 7, a man and his father would use the same woman to satisfy their sexual lust. Like I said, gross immorality. And when the women would yell from their windows, crying out, bring, let us drink. Bring, let us drink. Everybody is going to the Baal worship again. In this 8th century BC, and the only way the Baal worship could be brought to completion was through an act of sexual intercourse with a temple prostitute, male or female. The choice was up to the individual. Sounds pretty gross, doesn't it? Should be. Maybe it was for that reason. I can't say for certain, but I think, knowing what I've learned about Hosea, I think that might have been the reason he wasn't married yet. He didn't want to marry into that kind of people. It was hard enough to preach for people like that, to where gross immorality was the everyday standard. And maybe for that reason he decided not to marry, but he's already grown. He's already a prophet. And God comes to Hosea and says, take thee a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. Now, I'm grateful for those children because I know the children weren't such a thing as whores when they were born. But because they're living in a society that's so prevalent with it, they will probably become that way, and so might his wife as well. So marry a woman knowing that she's going to become guilty of whoredom and have children knowing they will become guilty of whoredom. A little later, he meets a woman named Gomer. I'm sure he loved her or he wouldn't have married her. And I think she really loved him at that time. I imagine she was swept off of her feet by a man like Hosea, especially in a land so vile. He was probably, maybe, I don't know, one of the few or maybe the only man who could bring to the marriage altar a purity of life and bring it to the marriage altar itself. And afterwards, she found one man, probably one of the only men in all of Israel, who could bring this treasure of an unsquandered purity to a married life. Hosea had the zeal of a poet, the ardor of a patriot. He had the heart of a prophet. And I'm sure for a while their house was filled with his love for her and her love for him as well. But you see, she did not share Hosea's number one concern. Hosea's concern was the fact that he was a prophet, and as a prophet, he had to preach condemnation, damnation, and judgment to the nation of Israel, as many of the prophets had to do. And I'm sure that after a while, even though it's not really written in the book, but having known many, many people in my life and know things about people, I would think that it probably took place where she would say, oh, you love your work more than you love me. Preach, preach, preach. That's all you want to do. All you want to do is talk about destruction, damnation, and judgment. All my friends are going away. They don't want to be around me anymore because you're harsh preaching to them. The girls and the men that used to be my friends no longer come around. We no longer get to go to the revelries and the parties. We don't participate in the Baal worship either. And she would say things to him like, and I don't care what God says. We don't have to follow that tacky old Jehovah. There's other gods out here. These folks in town got different gods, and they have a lot of fun. And that's what I want. I want to have a lot of fun. Sounds sad, doesn't it? These are some of the things that people would have had to put up with in that day. And Hosea would say things to her like, honey, don't you understand that these are the things that are leading our beloved nation into eternal damnation and destruction? We must avert this. And God has given me the opportunity to preach to his people, our people, and warn them of the coming destruction that's going to come on Jerusalem and upon all of Israel. And she'd say, I don't care what God's done. Like I said, he's not the only God anyway. There's other gods we could turn to. But Hosea had one purpose, and that was to warn his country, Israel, of their coming doom. And now he's living in a house that you could hardly call a home any longer. The way things are going at his home, they're not real congenial. Then something happened. Into the marriage, after a while, sweet angel of suffering visited his home, and a child is born. In the course of time, this boy was born into their home, and he was told to name the boy Jezreel. Now, Jezreel is not in itself a bad name, but it has double meanings. Jezreel is a valley, you see, that runs from a mountain called Carmel down to the mountain of Tabor in Gilboa. The valley of Jezreel, the valley of Megiddo, where God's people, his troops, always won their battles, even though they were vastly outnumbered. And God said, name him Jezreel. So he was naming him for the victory that would come. But you see, that's more than the story has, because Jezreel also means scattered. And that's what happened to Hosea in his home. He became scattered from his wife and even his children. A sad state of affairs, you might say, most definitely. But you see, Hosea had a promise in his mind. He said, this boy's going to put one hand on me and one hand on my wife and bring us back together like never before, and we'll be a united family again and praising God, and all will be well. But he was wrong again. Rather than bringing them together, that boy drove them farther apart, for his name meant just that, scattered. And then later a daughter is born, and God says, call her name Lo-Ruhamah. Lo-Ruhamah, which means unloved or unpitied, which was perfect for Hosea because that's the way he was at home now. Unloved and unpitied. Time goes by again, a child is born. God says, call his name Lo-Hami. Now, it's not spelled that way in English because you can't say Hami in English without spitting on people. That's why I'm glad y'all are far enough away that I don't spit on you. But Hebrew people do not pronounce an A as an A, as we do, like Ami. They don't say Ami because it's a long A. They say Hami. It's pronounced like that. It's kind of like the Hebrew lady who said her friend next door goes to Alcohol Anonymous. He's no longer drinking and he doesn't smoke cigarettes anymore. And all of that stuff, she's trying to make him look good. Well, that's what happens when you get into the Hebrew language. You don't stand real close when you talk. Hebrew people kind of get in a group and they all back up about 2 feet from one another so they don't spit on each other. And I learned that studying Hebrew in Sunset many, many years ago. But the question comes out, I'm sure after a while, it's not written in the book, but I can picture her saying these things. You don't really love me anymore. You love your preaching more than you do me. That's all you want to do is preach, preach, preach. As I said, years went by till that last son came, Lo Hachmi. And still, with all she's done wrong, by the way, that name, Lo Hachmi, means not mine. Now, there's no doubt about it, that the child that's been born into his family is not even his. Could have been that way of the first ones, not sure. But we know this one isn't because God said, name him, not mine. He was not Hosea's child. And what a tragedy for him. And still, he doesn't divorce her. This must have been consternation to his friends and total amazement and scorn from his enemies. They would say things like, the man who has a spirit is a fool. The prophet's mad. He preaches morality and lives with a whore. It had to be tough on that man. He had to be strong in his relationship with God to keep listening to things of that nature. And then one day, Hosea comes home. And when he walks in the door, he doesn't smell any supper being cooked. He doesn't hear any wifely duties going on in the kitchen preparing a meal. It's just silent. And then he hears a whimper. And he hears a noise in a room. And he goes to that room, and there are his 3 children sitting there crying. Where's your mother? They don't have a clue. She's out on the streets again. In the midst of this, he finds his children, and the book doesn't say so, but I'm like a lot of you in here, and not this little crowd right here, but us older people. I have found in counseling over 40 some odd years that no woman ever leaves her husband without leaving a note. They feel compelled to leave a note just to dig it in one last time. And he found, I believe, a note on the table. It says, Hosea, I no longer love you. Haven't loved you for years. Don't love the children. Don't care anything for them. Now, I've gone after my lovers. Leave me alone. Don't look for me. I'm not coming back. So don't try to find me. Sincerely, but no longer yours, Gomer. And she's gone. He put his children to sleep and went over to the window, and he looked out that night, the next day, and the next night, and the next day, and the next night. Nights without any stars and days without any sunshine. Until finally he realized, and it dawned on him, that she was really gone and she was never coming back. Then looking back through the telescope of his own tears, I believe he saw deeper into the heart of God than anybody had ever seen before or would ever see again until Jesus died on the cross. I think that Hosea saw 3 things. Number 1, he saw the real magnitude and character of sin. 16 times in the Hebrew language, in the book of Hosea, the word whoredom is used to just describe sin. Any sin against God was looked upon as whoredom. Let me share with you the reason why, so you're not perplexed over this. Israel was God's wife. He said in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31 through 34, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, that will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers in the day I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, though I was a husband to them. A wife breaks a covenant with her husband when she commits adultery. That's when she's broken her covenant. And that's what God says it is. And so, looking back through the telescope of his tears, he begins to see deep into the heart of God. He sees the magnitude and the character of sin, and 16 times that word for whoredom is used for the word sin. Don't know how many of y'all have traveled around the world. I have a couple of times. I lived in France, Germany, Italy, England, Japan, Spain, Vietnam, Taiwan, Korea. I've been exposed to a lot of things in a lot of countries in the world. And we think sometimes that things on the streets of America are bad. But you go to a place in Saigon, it was called Bird Street. They called it that because you could find any animal in the world or snake in the world that you wanted to buy on that street. Or women or young boys. You could buy them all on Bird Street. Very ungodly, vile, terrible place. And you would see girls on the street who would beckon to you, trying to lure you in. And you could have a girl for 100 piastres for one night, which is about $4. That was their price. You could have negotiated it. And you look at them and it was ugly. I don't mean ugly, I mean ugly. I asked this girl how old she was. She said she was 25. He looked 70. Maybe she was 25. That's the kind of life they live. That's what it does to you. And in doing so, she was selling her body as a whore on the streets every single day of her life. This happens in a lot of places where American soldiers go. It happens even in the Bible. When the children, the sons of Israel went over into the promised land, they went into a lady's house. She's called Rahab, the harlot. Now, people want to make excuses and say, oh, no, those are men of God. I don't care what they're men of. Men do that when they get away from home. When they're not faithful to God like they should be, they end up at some woman's place and usually in trouble. They lucked out. They got help from her. But when you look at this and realize what's going on in their life, it's nothing good. Nothing good whatsoever. Nothing helpful. But when looking at the real magnitude of sin, when I read the book of Hosea and realize that when we had been walking in sin with both eyes open, that's exactly what we were as children of God. When you and I are walking with both eyes widely open, and we go ahead and commit a sin anyway, that's committing an act of whoredom against God. God is being sinned against when we commit acts such as that. Jesus calls the church the bride of Christ. And when we don't follow it faithfully, then we're committing adultery even against the Christ. And so we say, well, this one little sin's not going to hurt very much. It's all right. It'd be okay to commit just one little sin. Aren't there some little sins that go along with the big ones? You see, Hosea is learning, and I hope we are too, that sin is not a trifle. Sin's a tragedy. And as a tragedy, he's learning that sin is something you don't toy around with. Because you see, Hosea no longer has a wife. He no longer has a mother for his children. And he no longer has the family that he once had before. Secondly, he found out that God is a suffering God. Our God's a suffering God. Young man was here last week, Mani. I come up here and I asked him a question since he was very educated in that area. I said, how many gods do the Hindus have? I said, he's something like 300 million. I said, how many of them suffer? What? I said, how many of the Hindu gods suffer? His answer were, Hindu gods never suffer. Another man said, not here, but in another place when I asked that question, he said, your Jesus suffered, but we don't have gods like him. Our gods are strong, they're not weak. So I asked those other men, and I asked this young man here the other day, because I'd never met him before. How many of those gods have an empty tomb? Right? Do any of those Hindu gods have an empty tomb? Ooh. We have the only God who was carried into a tomb and walked out of it on his own, without human help or human hands. We don't have weak gods like your Jesus. Yeah, well, my Jesus walked out of a tomb after being placed in there dead. And do you know who killed Jesus? Nobody. You remember Jesus said, no man takes my life, I lay it down, I'll take it up again. You can't kill Jesus. Can't be done. It was a miracle nearly that Hosea discovered that God suffers, but how did he learn that God suffers? Watch him preach. Watch Hosea preach. Here he is on the streets of Samaria about to preach about destruction, and there goes his wife down the street with another man. And he watches her, and she turns into that man's hut. Next day, she's with another man going down the street and goes into his hut. Next day, he's preaching, and here she comes with a fellow of even lesser degree in society. Next day, she's going down the street with a staggering town drunk. And here's his hell. He still loves her. He still loves Gomer. I thought the first time I read that, I'd kill them all. I would be in a jealous rage and a fit, get everything I had that could fire a projectile and go after all of them. Hosea didn't do that. And it's sad because watching his wife going down the street day after day and still loving her deeply, I think he gets to thinking, look, if I'm suffering like this because of the unfaithfulness of my wife, imagine how God suffers because of the unfaithfulness of his wife. If an infinite creature like me suffers, how infinitely greater must be the suffering of a fine infinite God. I think that's how Hosea figured out that God suffered. You know, it's a biological fact that you can grade animals on a life scale by the way they feel pain. Humans feel pain tremendously. Birds even feel pain. I've seen birds who build their nest up on the side of a little river or creek, and water comes rushing in from a snow up north, and that mama bird's trying to save her chicken or the little chicks in that nest, and she's just flying over them screaming bloody murder. I think she was crying for help, but I didn't speak bird. I didn't know what to do. But you see, when you see something and someone hurting, it depends on the life scale where they are. Now, crabs are a different story. Crabs are so low on the life scale that one crab can eat another crab while it's being eaten by a third crab, and none of them realize they're being eaten. They don't sense pain. There's been times I thought my sensory perception, I wish it was like a crab's, because I stubbed my toe or my shin bone and it really hurts. I don't know about crabs, but mine does. But that's how you judge things on the life scale, how they feel pain. Well, things went on in his life. But you know, that happens in I've visited a lot of hospitals. And I've been to places where mothers lie. They don't lie intentionally. Saw a mother at a hospital in Lubbock, Texas. She was there visiting her son. He was about 21 years old. All tore up from a DWI, and he was the DWI. driving while intoxicated. He's in a coma. And he died in total objection to anything his mother wanted him to do. He was everything Mama said, he was against it. And she stood there at his bedside and she said, he was a good boy. I think she was thinking about 4 or 5, but not at 21. He wasn't a good boy. About 2 days later, he passed away. I went to the hospital every day to see him. And I felt really sorry for the lady. I really did. There was nothing I could do other than pray for her. He never regained consciousness. But you see, Hosea knew something that a lot of people didn't know. He knew God. And he knew that God cared. But as high as that woman in the hospital room was above a crab, God's that much higher than us in feeling pain. God suffers for you and me when we sin. Because he's made ways for us not to, and we go ahead and do it. Hosea found out that God was also eager to forgive, and he still is. Hosea could see Gomer on the street, and he'd be preaching, and he'd tell someone, wait a minute, I can't preach any longer. Wait a minute, I'll be right back. And takes off after Gomer. Honey, the kids and I really miss you. You can come home anytime you want. The door's open. About all she could probably say was, did you read my note? I don't love you anymore. I love guys like this. We're having fun. Leave us alone. Don't care for the kids. Don't care nothing about them. Leave me alone. I'm having fun in life now. That hurt him. It really, really did, I'm sure. Several years back when I was living in the Lubbock area, Abe Lincoln and one of the church members went out to a Bible camp, and there's a young lady out there who had cut her wrist. Her husband was a young preacher. And they come to see her, and she was lying there on a cot. She wasn't going to die. She wasn't about to. She did a poor job of that, as she'd probably done most things in her life. But Abe asked her a question. Her name wasn't Mary. I'm just going to use that name. He said, Mary, do you believe God loves you? She said, no, Brother Abe, God don't love me. He said, well, let me ask you another question, Mary. Do you believe I love you? She said, oh, yeah, Brother Abe, I know you love me. There's no doubt about that. You love me. And he asked one more question. And that's the kind of wisdom that caused Sunset to make him an elder. He said, Mary, who do you think it was that caused me to love you like that? Now, she didn't get over all of her hang-ups that day. She knew that God loved her then because she knew Brother Abe loved her. Likewise, Hosea loved Gomer, and he knew God loved him, and he believed that God was on his side. And he found out that God was eager to forgive, even when he knew she probably wouldn't come back home. Story's not over. One day, Hosea is told, Gomer's selling herself on the slave market. She's gotten to the point now, and her appearance isn't what it should be. Nobody wanted her anymore. All of her fun was gone. When you get to looking like you live on the street, nobody wants to have fun with the street. So she went to sell herself on the slave market. I don't know what Gomer was doing when he heard it, but what he did, he stopped doing whatever it was, ran by the house and got all his meager savings. An omer and a half of barley and 1,500 shekels of silver. And he took off for the auction block. And there he bought her back. He still loved her. Boy, that's some kind of love, isn't it? He still loved her. I could hear the auctioneer. What have I bid for this woman? I know she's old beyond her years. but she could still clean your house, sweep your floors, cook your meals, watch your kids, and you go out and have fun. What am I bid for? And Hosea bid everything he brought, 2.5 omers of barley and all his shekels of silver. I'm told what money he had was the price of a wounded slave. That's what he paid for his wife. He took her home and he set her in a corner and he said, "You will abide here for many days, and you'll not be a wife to me, and neither will I be a husband unto you, until you can return to me in faithfulness and purity." What happened? I don't know. I'd like to believe she came back to him, but if she did, it destroys the parable that I have in this. Because you see, in this lesson of Hosea and Gomer is the lesson of God and Israel. And I don't believe she ever came back, because Israel never came back to God in holiness and purity that God wanted them. They never came back to this day. They still reject his Messiah. I don't want to end on that kind of a note, so let me share with you the story of a man I heard about in Chicago just before the Depression. He was already a pretty wealthy man. He heard about the Depression coming on and how finances were going crazy, and he liquidated everything he had and bought gold. Only gold. And he worked day and night and day and night and day, and he exhausted himself. He went to his doctor, and the doctor said, "Boy, you can't keep this up. It'll kill you. You need to go somewhere where it's really, really quiet and serene." He said, "Doc, I don't know where that is." The doctor said, "I have a farm in Kentucky." Now, remember, this is back in 1928, 29. Kentucky was still a very beautiful place with those old mansions they had over there and the beautiful hillsides. And so the doc says, "I've got a farm. You can go there. Nobody will bother you. You can go out and walk when you want to and just be part of nature." So he took that. He drove all the way to Kentucky. While he was in Kentucky, one day while he was out walking, he saw this beautiful young Kentucky girl. Fell head over heels in love with her, married her, and came back to Chicago just as happy as a pig in slop. He was really thrilled. And after they'd been married for about 7-8 months, she grew very ill. She was in such pain that she began to scream all day and night. The neighbors in the community where the doctor lived got out petitions that got to stop this woman. We can't sleep at night. She screams and hollers all night. Sounds like somebody's killing her. The police investigated. They said, "You're going to have to do something." He said, "What do I do?" Nobody could give him an answer. And the doctor that he went to the first time said, "Why don't you take her back where you found her? Maybe getting around old familiar scenes will help her come back to herself." So he took her back to Kentucky, kept her there for a month. Same screaming all day, every day. After a month, they kept saying, "You're going to have to put her in an asylum." He said, "Never." Asylums in those days were called snake pits. They were anything like what we have today to help people who have mental problems. But that man loved her. He said, "I'm not putting her in one of those hell holes. No way." So he brought her back to Chicago, bought 4 city blocks. That's how much money he had. Built a huge mansion there and walls all the way up around it to block the sound. Still, neighbors complained. They could hear it at night. He didn't know what else to do. He took her back to Kentucky one more time. Stayed there for 2 more months. Didn't help at all. Drove her back to Chicago for the last time. Went around and opened the car door, got her out, and scooped her up in his arms. As he scooped her up, her head just flopped over on his shoulder. He thought prayerfully that she had just died, just so she would be out of her misery. But he was wrong. She was asleep for the first time in months. She had fallen into a deep sleep. He took her up and laid her on his big bed in the bedroom upstairs of their mansion, laid her down there and sat with her all night long. From 10 o'clock till 6:30 in the morning, he sat right there and didn't move. 6:30, his son's coming up. He went over and he pulled the shades and opened it up, and the light came across her body. Twinkle of the light caught her face, and her beauty was not quite as good as it used to be. And she stretched and she yawned, and she caught him out of the corner of her eye. She looked, she said, "Honey, where have you been?" He said, "Right here, darling. Just waiting on you to come home. Just waiting for you to come home." That's the story of God in Hosea. God was waiting on his children Israel to come home. Now the question is, where are you with God today? Do you need to come home? Oh, you can have a physical life out here in the world like all the rest of the world has without God. But if you've ever had a relationship with God, I have been there and done that. I know how wonderful it felt to come back to God. Never ever wanted to leave again. So if you need to come back to God tonight, why don't you do that right now as we stand together and we sing?